My name is Bruce Wiggins. The topic this morning is James Luther Adams and what he might have to tell us about our current circumstances. For those of you who don't know, James Luther Adams was probably the preeminent Unitarian-Universalist theologian of the 20th century. We have readings by him in our hymnal, and if you go to General Assembly, you'll often hear a mention of his works and topics. I found out recently that James Luther Adams' grandsons are here in Milwaukee, and one of them is a member of this church. Ted joined the church not too long ago. I've met Ted and Robert here in Milwaukee in activist circles, and it's perhaps no surprise that James Luther Adams, as a social theologian, would have grandsons who are activists. So we're fortunate to have them both here today, and let me introduce Ted first to introduce his brother.
Yeah, thanks for suggesting this, Bruce. Robert has put in a lot of work on this, and it's very timely, so it's very good that you could make the connection here with the church. So, as Bruce said, I'm Ted Kraig, and we're brothers, and it would be great if nobody mentions that we look anything alike. I hear that all the time. So I just one question. How many people have heard of James Luther Adams? Raise your hand if you have. Okay. 2 or 3. Okay, that's not surprising. That's just the way it is. When I was a kid, the minister at Third Unitarian Church where I went used to call him the Pope of the Unitarian Church, which that's not right. But Unitarians don't have popes. That's the whole point of Unitarianism, right? But he was very significant, and a lot of people in the 20th century were aware of him, especially ministers. And the question is, what does this theologian of yesteryear have relevance for today? In what way? And for me, and I think for Robert to some degree, it starts with the condition we're in right now, where all of us know our democracy has been deteriorating. We may have made a major leap towards authoritarianism very recently. And more broadly, for most of my life, I've been worrying over the climate, which is not just another issue, but really could spell the doom of our civilization and even the whole species if you understand the science behind this. And what's important about climate is that is happening. It's a sign of a dysfunction in our society, right? And the dysfunction, in my view, is that you have super rich people and giant corporations seeking profit, and they're sociopathic, right? They're doing things that they're fully aware what the consequences are. And that's, of course, how our democracy is deteriorating too, right? We've got just like obscene inequality racially and economically. The whole system has become problematic, and maybe the deepest and most disturbing is what we're doing to the natural systems we depend on. Not only do we depend on these natural systems, we are these natural systems. We're no different, we're part of nature, and we're in extreme jeopardy right now. And that's something that we believe, Robert has long believed, and I've long believed, that our grandfather has some relevance, something relevant to say about it, in particular, that to address these issues, we need a kind of a religious fervor. And we don't necessarily have it, and I'm as guilty of that as anybody. You get into your circles to do your work, and you can be tepid. You don't want to be ruffling feathers. These are your allies, right? When really what we need is urgent action on a scale we've never seen before. We need a kind of religious conversion to occur if we're going to cope with these problems. So, just to get to Robert, I've probably spoken too long already. Robert is the guy to do the deep dive. He is a really serious scholar. He got his PhD at UW-Madison, and he turned his dissertation into one of the top books in his field, and then he left academia. He never took a job as a professor, even though he could have been a big-time tenured faculty member. And he did it to work on social justice because he believed that we need to change this world for the better, and this was the way to do it. So for years now, he's been the head of Citizen Action of Wisconsin, which is one of the big social justice groups in the state. They're all over the state with branches in La Crosse, Wausau, Milwaukee, other places. So Robert has delved into this, and he can give you the connection, right, of why this is important to be aware of the theology of my grandfather, James Luther Adams. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ted, and great to be here. And Bruce, you can be forgiven for not knowing I'm also a member of this, because for over a year I've been writing this and not coming anywhere near any churches whatsoever. But I still have my name tag down there. So Hasn't been taken away yet. So, so I'm going to give you, the Cliff's Notes here. For people who want a deeper dive, the James Luther Adams Foundation, if you web search just James Luther Adams Foundation, has a lot of resources. You can read more about our grandfather, but in the forum section, which is easy to get to, it will soon have a full 65-page monograph I've written that has all of these themes and a video of the talk I gave at Meadville Lombard Theological Seminary, or school, excuse me, they don't call us a seminary, 2 weeks ago. So you can get more, and we'll have the Q&A. But just a little bit about my experience with our grandfather. And Ted, even though we're called twins sometimes, see, I violated Ted's rule, is 5 years younger, and he had a different kind of exposure and experience. So I was old enough that I was packed off to Cambridge, and my grandparents also had a cottage in the Berkshires most summers and spent the summer with them. So I had a deep immersion in James Luther Adams and his work, and his wife, my grandmother, Margaret Ann Adams, was actually a power in her own right and had a huge influence on him, and probably the bigger initial influence on me. She was the one making sure that this contact took place, and she was the lefty. So she insisted on having her towel hung on the left side of the rack to indicate that he, who was closer to a Democratic Socialist, was not progressive enough. And so I was greatly influenced by her as well. In fact, it was a bit of dialectic. And Ted's impact, since Ted was much younger and he was being packed off to other kinds of camping vacations with our father rather than my more staid vacations, got more of it later from my grandfather a bit, but also just because of how it influenced me. So there was but both. And so I was in many ways, as my grandfather believed strongly, that origins are absolutely essential, that origins shape our identity. He liked an Emily Dickinson poem that called it the hound of my daddy. He talked about the hound of his identity. And so he always reflected on his premillennialist fundamentalist roots, where he was told by our great-grandfather that any day they might not wake up in the house, that they might be in the air, and they'd meet in the air, that God was about to end the world. And he used to tell Ted probably remembers the dust storm story. The dust storm story was about him being lost when he was 4 years old, miraculously making it back to the house in this vicious dust storm in eastern Washington, and then his father essentially being in prayer with the family and actually believing at this point this was it, and this was Armageddon. So, but he then, at University of Minnesota, rebelled against religion. He and his friends published a broadside called The Angel's Revolt. So he became anti-religious as he got into philosophy and history and all of the facts that were ignored by the kind of religion he came up in. But then what happened is his senior year, there was a 2-term public speaking course by a professor named Frank Rarig. If you go to University of Minnesota campus, there's a building named after him. Significant figure, a founder of the modern discipline of rhetoric, which I ended up being in, though we didn't know about these connections. And when he was leaving senior year after the second, he'd given all his speeches in the whole 2-semester class attacking religion. And he was remarking, walking out of the classroom at the end of the last semester of his senior year, he didn't know what he was going to do after college. And Professor Rarig said, "I've known all along what you were going to do, Adams." And in front of everyone, because all the religious members of the class all saw him as an enemy, right? Said, "You're going to be a preacher." And he said that sarcastically with accent. And he was so shocked, he went to him. He said, "Come around sometime, we'll talk about it." And after 4 hours, Professor Rarig, who was a Unitarian, convinced him that he didn't hate religion, he was obsessed with it. He hated an unreflective, unexamined religion that was separate from science and facts. And so within 6 weeks, he was off for Harvard Divinity School. So he often wrote about what kind of impact a mentor would have, and he wrote a lot of letters to Rarig, which are in the University of Minnesota archives, about various things going on in his career, by the way. And in the longer paper you can get on the James Lewis Foundation website, I go into that. Now, as for me and the influence on me, I was, well, implanted with the idea that we need to get social justice, especially racial justice, and had searing experiences. For example, was riding back from South Station in Boston to Cambridge with my aunt, their oldest daughter, my Aunt Eloise, and it was during the Boston bus boycotts, where there was vicious white backlash against integration, and the cab driver started carrying on quite horribly about what black people were doing to the city and how horrible this was. And my little aunt, because he was scary, big and scary and red-faced, tore into him and told him off and told him what was wrong with his position. And I was terrified the whole trip and couldn't have been more relieved that we made it back safely to Cambridge, to my grandparents' house. Well, this concerned them greatly. There was much adult whispering in the kitchen when they thought I couldn't hear it. And the result was we had a part-time black housekeeper, Ann Thompson, who I was very close to. I look forward to seeing her as much every summer as my grandparents. My grandmother took us over to her house in Roxbury, the black section of Boston, where I played with her nephews all afternoon. The adults sat and drank tea, and Ann cooked a big dinner. The point is, it was just a very normal visit. And on the way back, my grandmother landed on me the idea, which I already, being around them and my liberal parents, shared, that black folks are like everyone else, and the problem here is white folks who are standing in the way of them being fully equal. And so that so filled me with wonder about the whole situation, how this could be. When I grew up in Oak Park in suburban Chicago, which is on the L line, and when you hit the Oak Park border going east and hit Chicago, you go to the desolate west side of Chicago, where it's like, when I was growing up, looks bombed out almost, right? There's been some more urban development which is gentrification, quite frankly, closer to downtown now. And I used to stare since I was a little kid and just try to theorize how it could be this way. Could it be the folks who live here's fault? And I'd watch normal people in their work clothes get on and off the L, right, and living normal lives. And of course, I came to a structural analysis, right, that this was something we were imposing on people, but that was all set into motion. Now, what was seated in me was a contradiction. That is, my grandfather worked all the time. I don't know if you remember, Ted, how hard he worked. You'll see, if you look at the bibliography on the James Lewis website, an amazing corpus of work. One of the respondents, a professor of rhetoric and religion, who was one of my respondents, was intimidated by the corpus when I sent him the bibliography. You don't need to read all of that to respond to the paper. And he learned, because he worked his way through school on the railroad, he was one of those Horatio Alger heroes, and he read Horatio Alger. He was allowed to, miraculously, by our great-grandfather. That he'd worked 3 jobs, sent money back home, worked himself through both college and theology school. And so he learned a kind of a trainman sleeping pattern. He never slept all night the rest of his life. And at Cambridge, I was across just around the corner in the living room from his study. And I knew that he would be, throughout the night, all of a sudden typing would start up. And it would go for an hour and a half, and then it would stop again. Then there'd be another couple hours more. This was the pattern. So I really got the idea of what it was to be a scholar and fully educated, and both of them drilled that into me. But my grandmother was always the agitational critic, the real organizer, right? And she always thought he was too focused on big ideas, scholarship, things for a small group of theologians and ministers like the Reverend Jennifer, and not enough on social action. When his first stage of his career, when he was at Meadville and University of Chicago, from the late 30s to the mid-50s, she drove him into heavy social activism where he and her were on the front lines of racial justice when it was really dangerous, before the classical civil rights movement, before Brown v. Board of Education. And he also founded independent political organizations like Independent Voters of Illinois that had a huge influence. When he went back to Harvard in the mid-50s, he was connected but less active. He wasn't a leader as he was before. She regretted that, and so she basically, her dialectical claims to me was that I had to change the world, so to speak, create a just society, but at the same time I had to be fully educated in order to know what to do. And so I ended up, strangely, it didn't really work out, try to do both. So I got the full humanities PhD, 10 years at UW-Madison, which produced a book and articles, but I couldn't pull the trigger on the academic career, hearing the hound of my daddy with my grandmother, and therefore ended up first working as state council director for a major union, SEIU, and then ultimately gravitating over to this kind of work. Now, what's interesting is, and I'm going to skip over this, is going to be over easy on the academic connections. I wrote a lot in a similar vein to him in a lot of ways. But what was missing was the theology. So I had, in many ways, mysteriously, his social ethics without the theology. Now, how did I get the theology with all of those interactions, right? He never proselytized me. My grandmother was a Unitarian churchgoer, Unitarian-Universalist, but was agnostic. By that point, anyway. I don't know, she came up in the church. She might not have been in the 20s and 30s, but when I knew her, and all of the three daughters were my two aunts, my mother, and I don't know, Ted can tell a story when we get to the Q&A about how hard it was to have him explain to a kid what God was even, what religion was. So it wasn't exactly like some of the, he never wrote a, JLA's Theology for Kids kind of book, right? And so it's odd, though, a lot of, if you read his works, he believes Jesus is the great teller of parables. And so he actually, parables, stories, anecdotes, that is the way we create religious meaning. And in particular, since we're liberals, and he was both a critic of liberalism and a fierce defender of liberalism at the same time, we're creating something open that people still make their own choice, but we're giving them a context for making the decision. And so he told us stories all the time, which had religious implications. I remember him telling me the parable of the sower, but frankly, I didn't take them as religious. There was one time, though, that he was, after my grandmother had died, she died, it was like a death watch. We were all brought to Cambridge right before my high school, and pulled out of school, and it took like 3 or 4 weeks. So it was both Ted and I, it was a searing experience, but then we'd see him in visits and the like. But this was before then, actually. He was speaking in Chicago and staying at our house. My mother was single, so she was dating, single mom. And so he was in charge one night, and I used to like to go to this game room that was the local Catholic church down the street was holding. He got very worried that I was being proselytized. And he interrogated me, enough of that scared me about whether the priests, and finally let me go. So I guess he was not willing, he didn't proselytize himself, but he was unwilling for authoritarian conservative religion to claim my soul. So there was a fair amount of interest there. But as far as we were both very interested in language. We're both, even though we're interested in science and believe in science and reason, also saw its limitations. He wrote a lot about mythology and the non-rational motivations in human judgment and human action, and I did as well. And a lot of my work was proximate to religion, like what's the influence of religion, like the social gospel movement in the progressive era, or in the civil rights era, the influence of religion, right? But never in it. And then I very much embraced, which he does, a consequentialist ethics. That is, and the way he'd call it is the Jesus principle, by your fruits you will know them. Now what that means is, what that parable is about, it's about how people are gonna say they're on your side, right? They're gonna say that they're part of the flock. How do you know? You know by their fruits. But he also took it from the progressive philosophers of the early 20th century, especially Charles Sanders Peirce and William James to a lesser degree, and John Dewey. But literally, the measure was, so if you're trying to deal with race, the measure was not that you don't have racism in your heart, or that you have black friends, or that you worry about it, or that you do performative acts that show you're on the right side. It's what have you done to challenge and to reverse racial inequality? And so that's very relevant to climate, which I'm going to get to. So we had those. We also, I wrote articles critical of liberalism for not being strong enough. His criticism of liberalism, he thought liberalism was essential, there was no alternative, but the freedom that liberalism gives you could be abused. The paradox of freedom was that we have the paradox to either use it or not use it, and frankly, since liberalism, the way he defines it, happy to talk about liberalism, and he's actually very, very good on the history of all the different strands of liberalism, political, religious, philosophical. That's why the longer paper on the website is called James Luther Adams and the Crisis in American Liberalism for that reason, and I'm a liberal. It needed ultimately be stronger to achieve its values. It came out of the left wing of the Reformation and the revolt against authoritarian religion. Then it became the source of modern democracy, is his argument. I'm giving you his periodization of history. Therefore created political and economic liberalism. Economic liberalism at first was a liberation of feudalism, then itself became an oppressive force, which we see very much today, and he saw in his own day. But what was missing was and this is controversial in modern Unitarian-Universalism, he's a believer. In fact, he wrote in a journal, probably the Reverend Jennifer has read for this now defunct journal quite often, the Unitarian Christian. There was such a journal for decades. And so he's a believer, but he has a very distinct version of Christianity that's much more ecumenical. He's unusual in that he doesn't emphasize the Father or the Son, but the third element of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. So that's one major distinction. That's very ecumenical because he sees it in non-religious places, like social justice places. He sees it in other world religions. Majority of Christian theologians don't, it has to be within the Christian framework. So that's distinct. The other big thing that needs to be understood about him is he was committed to what he called voluntary associations. That is cause-driven, especially cause-driven voluntary groups that try to change our society. He saw them as the heart of democracy. In other words, it's not the mechanism of voting or that people are elected. It is that there is this intermediary between the mass of people and power in society, political, economic, and that has the potential power to change society. He sees religion as commanding a prophetic mission. So there's a spiritual element. He thinks you need both of them. So in other words, he liked to use a metaphor where he compared two opposite sides of the pole. Karl Marx, interestingly cast as a religious figure here, and Soren Kierkegaard, the philosopher and religious thinker. Kierkegaard he classifies as entirely spiritual, where there is no mission about the outside world at all, but much to learn about the spiritual elements of religion, how it can make you feel meaning in life and deal with all its tragedies and are quite frankly the fact that we're all going to die and we worry about it all the time. And everyone we love or have loved is going to die. But on the other end, Karl Marx, who was entirely materialistic about changing the structure of society for justice with no spiritual element, he thought you needed both. But his major fear was not that we were going too much towards just the prophetic pole, right? Just changing society, that we were, and he traced this throughout his career, having an inward turn towards spiritualism and psychology and psychologizing everything. And so the me generation, et cetera, et cetera. And this is very much parallel to Robert Putnam's works, where he shows a real shift starting in the late 1960s, really, from from we to I. So he was tracing the same thing. But what would create the we, the balance being the prophetic, and he's very clear that we have to focus on consequences and results, between the prophetic and the spiritual, to balance them, it occurs within these voluntary associations, within churches, particularly the smaller creative groups within the larger group, and it occurs in society, and this is the important thing. I pointed out how his theology is ecumenical and that he focuses on the Holy Spirit. We can connect ourselves to God, who is a persuasion. We still have to decide to listen or not. This comes from the great philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who was one of his mentors at Harvard. So there's that. It's a persuasion, but in voluntary associations, they are ecumenical by nature. Religious liberals are called upon to be part of voluntary associations that are going to change the world, that are going to create democracy, racial equality, deal with the environmental crisis we face, the authoritarian economic system, plutocracy that's dominating our society, all of that. And so it's not that that Unitarian-Universalist churches have to go and lead the whole thing and become a universal religion. They need to participate in this broader civic awakening, but they have something unique to bring, and that he thought that religious commitment was deeper and created greater unity. I can tell you from trying to create unity within voluntary associations, we need a lot more of that, and it's very hard to get. And I write about that at length in the paper, but it's a real challenge to our ability to do what needs to get done, quite frankly, at this point, to save democracy and to save humanity. So interestingly enough, he, in a famous essay called The Prophet of All Believers, prophesied that, because his main emphasis was to getting religious liberals to step up and be a stronger kind of liberalism, where we will live up to our duty, do what we need to do to create justice in the world, okay, and love and peace in the world. He believed in power. He's often called a prophet to the powerful. He didn't mean the currently powerful. He meant us leaning into our power, but he's very much against all those who think power is corrupting necessarily. No, impotence, lack of power is corrupting. Power can be used for good or ill. It'll only be used for ill if we don't use it for good. So it's about accumulating necessary power, create social change. But he prophesied, because he was getting so worried about whether religious liberals would step up, that it might have to be done without them in secular spaces. So in a weird sort of way, without knowing it, because I had not returned to his actual written works, I fulfilled the prophecy by trying to do this in secular voluntary associations, his own prophecy, and I couldn't pull the trigger because I heard my grandmother's voice. And because Ted, and this was set in motion, Ted had come here to work on Ed Garvey's governor's campaign, which I was able to line that job up for him, but then he was in the position where I finished my PhD, because he was working in a major union, to line up the union position that was the alternative to just going into tenure track position and getting the tenure track job I could get. And that was all set in motion those summers with our grandparents, so all of those chains of events. But I want to focus, just in my limited time left, some implications here. First, look, having a healthy democracy is the thing we need to solve every other problem. And he would see the diminishment of what Putnam calls social capital, voluntary associations, people's in-person relationship to each other, to develop that kind of prophetic understanding of what are the problems of the time, what needs to get done, developing the power to do it. That is why we had Nazi Germany. He spent a lot of time in Nazi Germany before the war, barely escaped the last time. And he thought their lack of voluntary associations, that associational power, is what made them so vulnerable to Nazism, for example. And Putnam has traced this. It's declined dramatically, not just civic, but religious. And by the way, the Putnam research shows that religious folks are much more likely to be involved in civic voluntary associations. So the decline of religion is connected to the decline of civic voluntary associations. There's a technological element in that we now produce movements very quickly through social media, which don't have a shared analysis and therefore explode rapidly and then collapse rapidly. Like it looked like in 2020, we'd finally get criminal justice reform, and then we were in backlash mode a year later, because people didn't go through the slow, painstaking process of developing the consensus among themselves, face-to-face, one-on-one. So we have to restore that, but it means actually taking it back at that level. We can't just wish for better leaders or look for the magic message that's going to save us. Secondly, racial, look, he focused a lot. He wrote a brilliant sermon called Our Unconquered Past about racism when the Black Power movement was really, when white liberals didn't know how to respond to it, and Black Power leaders were taking over white meetings. And he didn't critique the Black Power movement at all. He said they were right about the objective conditions. The question is, and this is what he does on everything, what is our agency to actually change these conditions and to shift our identity and our sense of who we are, to rethink that and conquer our unconquered past and make that part of our identity and then do what needs to get done. What's scary, according to Putnam's research, is that black-white, the gap between black and white economic, wages, wealth, status, was closing gradually. This is very much against a lot of the narrative on civil rights. From 1900 to about 1968, the year MLK is assassinated, it's been frozen ever since. There's been more representation of more professional black people being in elected government, being in major corporations and other spaces, in entertainment and TV. But that is kind of a thin veneer. Overall, the economic conditions are as unequal as they were in 1968, which is stunning. And so and I go through in the paper in great detail all of the various writing that's occurred in the last decade and a half on race and how it relates to James Luther Adams's ideas on how to address it. But what I finally, and Ted hinted at, close on is the climate crisis, and that's in the longer paper. Look, folks, we have to cut emissions in half in order to keep at a warming level of 1.5% degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And we have to do that by 2030. Trump will be in office in January till 2029 right now, but we weren't on track even before. And there's research indicating we may have already blown through the 1.5 degree threshold. And the results make everything unimaginably worse. Currently, right-wing politics is being driven by immigration. It's a trickle now compared to what it will be. This is going to decimate the global South, black and brown people who created almost none of the carbon and got very little of the wealth. And there are going to be hundreds of millions, eventually billions of migrants, okay? The wildfires, the floods, the inundation of coastal cities where half of humanity lives, it is unimaginable not only the damage physically, but the damage to our society and our civilization, how much it's likely, if we don't change things, to supercharge right-wing movements and fascist movements beyond anything we're looking at right now that make MAGA look like nothing and the Trump takeover look like nothing. But the problem is it's hard to get even liberals organized around this. It's seen as one as many issues. People can't agree on what to do. This is where JLA's consequentialist ethics come in. The only thing that matters is cutting emissions as rapidly as possible. By the way, we can do so by increasing economic prosperity and reducing racial inequality. That's a massive investment, right? But it's not that big a percentage of our wealth, actually. Estimate is about 2% of global GDP would do it. It's actually a small percentage, but it's taking on major powerful actors like utilities, like fossil fuel companies, like Wall Street, that invests in all of them and really pulls the strings. And so what's interesting about JLA, unlike most liberal thinkers, is do people know the term eschatology by chance? That is about kind of you see a lot of it in right-wing religion where they're proclaiming apocalypse because of various things. Well, JLA brought that in from his premillennialist youth. He thought about what are the signs of the times, and what he was interested in is how the pressure of history, of the future, can influence the present. So he does the past and our identity, but it's the connection between them as to what we should do now, and that's what's necessary for people to unify, for people to actually do what is needed to do. If you think about World War II, there was clarity as to what happens if Hitler and Mussolini and a authoritarian Japan wins. So the pressure of that made us sacrifice and put it all together. Like people like to think back about, could we apply all the sacrifices of World War II to other problems? Well, you have to have this eschatological point of view. And so to do that, you would need, I think, because you also need a religion in this, because that creates potentially, my grandfather saw religion as two-sided. It's the source of most wars and conflict, because the evil for him is the perversion of the good. So it looks like it has good in it, like the good of community, but that's community defined as eradicating another community, that as opposed to a universal community that includes everyone. And so we need that very much, but we need a religion that is actually connected to science and the environment as well. Liberal religion is, in the Protestant denominations and Unitarian-Universalist, is declining faster than the others. They're all declining. So could we create, this is what his question is at the end of the Prophet of All Believers, could we create a prophetic religion source coming out of that's affecting all of the social movements? Now understand, to do that, Unitarian Universalism or any of the other liberal Protestant denominations, they don't have to become the universal religion in his view. They can become a persuasion on social movements. In addition, all other like-minded people from other religions can come in along the idea that we believe that there's this pressure of the future and this obligation to do this and do this now. And what's interesting is, because fiction's often ahead of fact, right? A lot of the climate, great literature in climate, proposes religions like this. Octavia Butler's Parable series, Margaret Atwood's Mad Adams series. It is a sub-theme in Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future. And then interestingly, in The Deluge by Stephen Markley, the most recent of these novels, there isn't any kind of religious revival. It's done by secular voluntary associations, progressive, and it ultimately fails. And I have to tell you, though, he's very, very insightful about what all the limitations of those are, and probably has the high watermark of what is possible, and it still loses in this novel. Those are all the things I've mentioned are all very great novels if you're interested. So I think the question is, how prophetic are we willing to be? Because ultimately he believed that liberalism was the only solution, but liberalism had to step up to its responsibilities and obligations. This is a much more kind of, I don't know, a muscular liberalism, a liberalism where people choose freely, but we have to come to decision. We are, he used the biblical phrase, in the valley of decision. And so it's right now that this is going to be decided. So that is a very, my Cliff's Notes version, but let me stop there to get what questions you have.
Wow, lots to think about.
And I'm sorry if I gave you a lot. I haven't quite thought about how to do this in this amount of time very well, so. Yes, sir. Yeah. There's not actually a connection on Luther. He's named after the older brother of his father. His father's James Carey Adams. Luther War Adams, who dies in his 20s, and Luther War with some friend back in antebellum era Virginia, his original family was slaveholders for over 150 years, actually. But interestingly, his grandfather, who we knew, fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy, brought a slave with him, but then after Reconstruction, Virginia ran on the ticket of a biracial party, a famous party called, one of the last biracial parties before Jim Crow really takes hold, called the Readjusters. And the backlash was so intense, he had to take his 8 sons and leave Virginia for their safety, and went first to Southwest Missouri, where he was a state representative, and then Eastern Washington, where my grandfather was born. So the Luther doesn't come from there. Now, as far as Sagan, and Sagan is a really penetrating, important thinker. Glad you brought him up. Grandfather wrote a lot about enlightenment, reason, and what were the limitations of the Enlightenment. And of course, he himself was a very scientifically, scientifically focused thinker himself. He is not saying there's no role for that, but it has its limits. People, when they are motivated by by narrative and mythological elements of narrative that make their life meaningful, and cultural ideas. And even the Enlightenment rationalist philosophers essentially created myths, according to JLA, that were hidden and denied to be myths. What's weird is I wrote about the same thing in social science and published an article on this about international relations theory and mythology. So I didn't know he had done the same thing until later. But one thing I'll say is, which I didn't just say, is one of the things that made me want to return to my grandfather's and actually read all of his works as a mature scholar myself and a social activist was that we had a 3-year end child poverty campaign that was based on actually doing it, like holding ourselves accountable to cutting it in half in 10 years and eliminating it in 20 years in Wisconsin, with other faith-based groups, with Wisconsin Council of Churches, with Wisdom, which I think you're an affiliate of, Micah, the faith-based network, and with Kids Forward, which is a great equity-focused policy shop in Madison. And for 3 years, we spoke at all these liberal churches around the state. I even got to give a sermon at the Unitarian Church that's up near the tip of Door County. On one Sunday, I was the sermon speaker. And I did feel this connection and this unity among, these would be the most active liberal religious congregants and ministers that would have one of these forums, right? There was something to build on there. I think, and that's what my grandfather would say, you're missing a whole part of humanity if you only focus on science. And I think that's what Sagan was saying, but you need the science, and then you need the affective part of human nature. He used to call, my grandfather, theology an affective science. So we need both in order to be fully human and therefore to fully motivate people and situate them in a way that they can do the good, because what evil is to him is the vacuum created when the good recedes. So when we abuse freedom and become overly individualistic and just look out for what we want to do, fascism and authoritarian religion fill the vacuum. And that is a very good explanation of what's happened in 2024 with this election, what's been happening for some time. That false religions, he says we're incurably religious, so false religions will rush in when true religions withdraw. Yes?
What would he and you say about Christian nationalism around now?
He was very worried about it. It's one of the things we had some dialogue about, because I was a high school and college debater, Ted was a debater, and we'd also do research, had research briefs. So I read a whole bunch of stuff when I was in high school about the moral majority and the new right in the late 1970s taking over and its threat to society, and had conversations with him about that. He had been worried about authoritarian religion for a very long time and writing about it. That was the one time, because he was considered the great bibliography, walking bibliography. Students would visit his house just to ask him what to read on something. He always tell them exactly what to read off the top of his head. He actually wrote down some of the books I had read that he hadn't read. One in particular by a Jesuit theologian, now emeritus at Marquette, Daniel McGuire, who wrote about this wrote a major book about this in the early 1980s. But if you read Christopher Hedges, one of his students, and one of his great contributions was just the number of students he had. He was a great teacher. Yeah. So at the end of his book, American Fascists, which is one of the better books out there, it's about 20 years old, about the rise of Christian fascism, at the very end, the last 10 pages are what JLA in his 80s taught us in his ethics seminar. And it's basically a whole rendition of how he thought that that ultimately fascism would come to this country in Christian robes. And so if you take a look at that, Chris Hedges also gave one of the papers that's on the James Luther Adam Foundation website in the forum section. He gave the forum probably about 10, 12 years ago. So all the papers are up there. So you could also see his paper on his teacher, James Luther Adams. So he saw it as central to all of this, and also was obviously, because of his Nazi experience, very focused on fascism. And a lot of what he thought about it was similar to some of the better philosophical writing now about what's going on with the right-wing movements all over the world, not just in the United States. Yes? Yeah, and in the longer paper, I write about the various fields of organizing, and it's as divided as Protestantism in terms of a lot of different sects. I think my grandfather's right. It has to occur within voluntary associations where much more powerful meaning is created and a lot greater unity, because the small groups of people can influence larger and larger groups. And that the problem we're seeing in part is we're trying to message things for a broken media environment. And social media that is set up for algorithms, and where disinformation by big utilities like Energy's fossil fuel companies is completely confusing people. And you're getting a lot of stuff from message people now saying, well, we need to avoid saying that it's really a threat to humanity or an existential threat of any kind, because that's off-putting to people. Well, you won't get the unity to actually cut emissions fast enough. You'll be guaranteeing crisis if you make that kind of retreat. And furthermore, gosh, doesn't the history of Christianity show that what I said was eschatology, that is, a threatening future can motivate people to make heroic acts and come together, right? Doesn't it prove that can't be true? That's the way they're testing it. But yeah, it's partly because we're within the broken environment, that's what's going to happen. But let's think about this. President Biden did something historic with the Inflation Reduction Act, and we need to think about how no one knew that, and it wasn't in this election, and they gave up trying to explain it. And in fact, the left, or the organized left, we could not get people organized, to understand that the magnitude of how important that law was, or the bigger investments you want to make in Build Back Better. We have a real problem just with our own unity and because you can't say I'm interested in racism and not realize this will be the greatest racial genocide the world has ever known. It's unimaginable, right? Immigration, it's going to be 1,000,000 times worse. Women's rights, LGBTQA plus rights, they're all going to be much worse. And there's a real question of, we can hit triggers, feedback mechanisms that make this, in the worst case scenarios, the earth uninhabitable. At the very least, large portions of it are going to be, and they're going to be more likely in places that are inhabited by black and brown people who got almost none of the wealth and produced almost none of the carbon. The United States produced 25% of the carbon up there, warming the planet. So yeah, we would need to figure it out, but I think it comes from the old style, organizing within churches and then in secular spaces. But he used to say that there were a lot of atheist spaces my grandfather, that were more religious than churches because churches had failed in their mission. At least the atheist spaces were talking about the problems of the world and how to address them. Though he's not a fan of atheism, what he says about atheism is that it's only a limiting philosophy. It just says, I'm going to disregard this whole other possible source of human meaning and human motivation. But it doesn't, it closes that off, but it doesn't add any meaning. But he came to a conclusion to reject humanism when he was in theology school. He followed Irving Babbitt for a while, and the way he put it is this. There's a painting by Millet called The Sower. Go back to the parable, the sower and everything. The first version of the painting, you can easily find it online if you put Millet, The Sower. The early version just shows the peasant casting the seed, and it's a close-up. But then he does a revision where it's pulled back and you see the whole field. What my grandfather says is that the reason he gave up humanism is because it only focuses on the human being without the universe that we reside in, and that you need to see the field and what would take root or what wouldn't work that the person interacts in. And that universe for him, that'd be his definition of God. Now he and his close friend Paul Tillich have a definition of God that is certainly not the man in the sky listening to our prayers. Okay, this is a much more metaphysical kind of view of God. Mm-hmm. Sure, just to give you. Oh yeah, sorry, I've been doing a bad job of that. The person asked about JLA's five smooth stones of liberalism. Now, interestingly, that essay was put together by a close colleague of his Max Stackhouse, who I knew as a kid. I knew all of his major colleagues would visit quite often. And he never wrote down the five smooth stones. Stackhouse derived those out of a series of articles on liberalism and created the five. In fact, but there is one article called Why Liberal from the late 1930s where he does four of the five. Stackhouse, but the other one's there, but I just want to put you, this is a bit of a reconstitution. But see if I can do this by memory. Number one is that everything is incomplete and therefore open to criticism. In other words, it's a pushback against this idea that free speech as we set it up after World War II is the only way to do free speech, right? And we therefore have to do it that way, right? Everything has to be perpetually open and incomplete. That everything has to be based on free will, that freedom is that people choose, so force is illegitimate. That power is essential to create the good. That's the third one that is in all of his works that Stackhouse decided to make one of the smooth stones. Power. Yes, that, in other words, that the only way, in fact, he has an article on peace where he says peace is not absence of war, peace is the building the power to prevent war. That's all a kind of power. And that you only, so in other words, we lack the power in the Middle East to create peace. It's not about the conflict just ends and then we have peace. So that's the third one. I know one of them is optimism. So this is along the lines of Theodore Parker, the Unitarian theologian's line, which was taken by MLK, that the arc of history may be long, but it bends towards justice. Now, this is not naive optimism. It'll all work its way out. People understand there's a climate crisis and it'll work out in the end. No, it's not that. It is that it's possible. So there's a difference between that and very skeptical thinkers and some strands of postmodernism that say it's all hopeless, okay? But it has to be our agency. Gosh, the fourth one, it is related to a lot of the things I've been saying, but I'm going to misquote the fourth one, unless Reverend Jennifer knows them by heart. it may occur to me what the fourth is, but he has a lot of, the four, I guess the five are incomplete themselves because there are other elements of his view. But anyway, those are four of the five for everyone. See, I didn't fully pass the test. That's a B, 80%.
Well, the second service has started. The 11 o'clock service has started. So let's go. If there's one last question, yeah. Before you answer that, I've just been corrected by Mark here with the forum that we can go a little bit longer for those that want to stay.
So it's interesting if you look at, he's speaking to the flock, which he means liberals. So he doesn't have a direct message for, say, the Christian nationalists, other than we need to fill the space with true, authentic religion, and then that will chase them out, right? He does have an optimism that if we do that, that there is a general advantage towards the good, but that's a theological view. It's not because human nature is inclined necessarily to that. So you don't have to worry about, finding common ground with, I don't know, the modern equivalents of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and the like. But the idea is, since it's done in fairly small creative groups, is to try to create this ecumenical consensus. Remember, he's focused on voluntary associations means, because we need power. None of us are big enough, right? So that's why we need power to work this out, and to work out not only what the signs of the times are and what needs to get done, and then a decision. There's an obligation to, in fact, that might be the fourth, is that we have an obligation to come to decision. That's certainly central of the fourth of the five smooth stones. That's certainly a key theme. So all of that needs to get worked out. I mean, it can be messy. Some people may not really be with us, right? I've found in social justice organizing, there are a lot of people that you can find common ground on that that first seem like they're just oppositional, right? And they just want to blow everything up. But there's a certain percentage of them that just want to blow things up to kind of, it's a performative act of trying to create justice, showing that I am on the right side of justice by disrupting this thing, right? As opposed to what are we going to do together to actually take on the bigger structural fights in our society. But with all of his sermons that I've read, it is mostly about us creating the unity to do this, us being liberals. And there's obviously some people who are going to be outside of liberalism, some that could be invited in if we could create a more dynamic, inviting movement. But Unitarian-Universalists don't need to be all things to all people in this, but we need to maximize what we could produce. And since 1960, the number of Unitarian-Universalists has declined by a third, and the country's twice as big. So we're not a growing religion right now. Could liberal religion be the growing religion that is creating real meaning for people, both the spiritual meaning and the meaning that comes with actually addressing the inequalities and the injustice and oppression in our society, and quite frankly, heading off what we're careening into, which is potential disaster. So I don't know if that's responsive. I don't know, it depends what's going on, what the space is, but I guess we're called upon to certainly try to do that and to find a space where we can be powerful, and maybe it's about finding the right space sometimes if one isn't workable. Yes, sir. Yes. So I'm going to avoid the thing that you get a lot of, where you have a lot of journalism out there on the left that kind of overclaims this is the group that's figured it out, right? So I'm not going to give you the silver bullet. What I'm going to tell you is that within social justice organizing, there is a prophetic wing of social justice organizing that is very consonant with what James Luther Adams says. And it has these kind of characteristics. First, it actually is focused on trying to shift power in society, away from the people who are running it now to something fully democratic where the marginalized have an equal voice, okay? And then there's another end of the continuum is one that wants to win very small fights but doesn't want to take on that broader fight. So JLA would be in that end of the continuum, okay? There's another one that is closely related is, are we focusing on just single constituencies? And there's a role for constituency organizing. Are we trying to create something ecumenical and universal, like a true multiracial, multi-gender, organizations? And he'd be more in the, we need more power, we need to bring more people together. And then finally, are we building durable institutions? Because a voluntary association is an institution that has staying power. There's a branch of organizing that's episodic. We come together to fight one power plant, then we all go away. Actually, you need ones that have permanence and they're building permanent power, like the difference between, occasional group of neighbors back in the day in a prairie village having some prayer services versus building a church and creating an institution, right, that has staying power that people can be invited to and come into, right? And so I've seen in the last 10 years a lot of positive development along the lines I've just laid out. Organizations, but also, and it's very fragile, organizations are temporarily very successful, then they have lulls and they have to reinvent themselves. Right now in the organizing space, we're engaged a lot nationally with a lot of groups in something called an organizing revival, which presupposes there's been an organizing lull. That's partly because we have a lot of people who just think being engaged on social media or becoming spectators, watching cable news, right, listening to the radio is action, but also the pandemic really separated people. And the bane of our existence right now is people just want to do Zoom meetings and not come into direct contact. And so I think there's been a lot of positive signs. I'm not going to give you one organization that has all figured it out, but it needs more people coming in, and it's not succeeded, but there's been, I think, a lot of positive developments, a lot of things have been laid in place. But we do need, if we're going to be liberals, some notion that it is possible, as impossible as it may seem, sitting here before the inauguration of Donald Trump. Okay. Thank you.
George, do you want to say something?
And I'll just say, if you go to the James Luther Adams Foundation website in the forum section, the full paper and a video of the Meadville talk will be there probably in about a week or so. So it's easy, and you can find other things about James Luther Adams and a lot of articles on that website.